My name is Reese. I'm 38 years old, a senior financial analyst at one of the city's top investment firms. Every morning, I wake up in my downtown penthouse, a sleek, glass-walled sanctuary that overlooks the restless heartbeat of the city below. That penthouse isn't just where I live, it's my fortress, my monument to years of late nights, sacrifices, and relentless ambition. It symbolizes everything I've worked for: independence, security, and above all, freedom from the chaos that has always seemed to follow my family. But no matter how successful I become, certain parts of my life refuse to settle. Family dinners, for example, have never been easy. To outsiders, our gatherings might seem like ordinary celebrations: laughter, clinking glasses, the kind of forced pleasantries families exchange to mask deeper tensions. But for me, these dinners feel more like trials, like walking into a courtroom where I'm silently defending my right to exist on my own terms. My parents and my sister Cassidy have always leaned heavily on me, financially, emotionally, practically, you name it. Somehow, because I'm the one who's built a life and a career, I'm expected to carry the weight for all of them. They expect me to be the safety net, the problem solver, the one who cushions their failures and cushions their anxieties. And yet, when I ask for respect or space, they see it as selfishness. Just last weekend, during what was supposed to be a light-hearted family celebration, the tension was thicker than ever. The room was filled with relatives, cousins, aunts, uncles, all smiling politely, but I could feel the undercurrent pulling at the seams. Cassidy, my younger sister, who hasn't held a steady job in years, spent the evening complaining about her struggles, with a mix of feigned exhaustion and entitlement. Her words were like a constant drip of dissatisfaction, barely masking the expectation that someone else, me, would come to her rescue yet again. Mom, as usual, was quick to back Cassidy up. Between bites of her salad, she casually dropped a comment that hit me like a punch. Cassidy really needs a place of her own. Reese, maybe it's time you considered giving her the penthouse. It wasn't phrased as a request. It was a demand wrapped in a smile. Everyone at the table seemed to wait for my reaction, as if I was some sort of family bank that could be tapped endlessly. I smiled politely, nodding as if I hadn't just been blindsided. Inside, my stomach twisted, a familiar sting of injustice settling deep. The penthouse wasn't just a property, it was my sanctuary, my symbol of years clawed back from neglect and expectation. Yet here I was, expected to surrender it without so much as a second thought, as if my hard work was somehow owed to them. The conversation shifted quickly after that, laughter returning to the table, but the damage was done. I felt invisible, like my achievements were meaningless in the eyes of my own family. They saw me not as a person, but as a resource to be used, a safety net to catch their falls. The room was filled with the sounds of celebration, but inside me, a quiet storm was brewing. I realized once again that no matter how high I climbed, I was still tethered to the weight of their entitlement. As I sat there, taking deep breaths to keep my composure, I couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was different, that the cracks in our family facade were widening. The polite smiles and forced pleasantries were paper-thin, barely concealing the rage and frustration bubbling beneath. That night, I left the dinner early, retreating to the quiet of my penthouse, the one place where I still felt control. But even as I closed the door behind me, the echoes of their words lingered. Maybe it's time you considered giving her the penthouse. The sentence replayed over and over in my mind, a challenge and a threat. I knew then that this wasn't just about a property. It was about control, about power, about how far I was willing to go to protect what's mine. Not just my penthouse, but my dignity and my right to be treated with respect. The battle lines were drawn, and I was standing right in the middle of them. This unfairness runs so deep, it's woven into every fiber of my family's story, etched into my past long before I ever stepped foot in that penthouse. Growing up, Cassidy was the golden girl, the favored one who could do no wrong. Mom and Dad wrapped her in a protective bubble, excusing her mistakes with a shrug or a gentle sigh. Meanwhile, I was the responsible one, the good daughter who was expected to clean up the messes left behind. It wasn't just about chores or grades. It was about carrying the weight of family expectations, always being the one who had to hold it together. I remember one moment with painful clarity, my 18th birthday. I had been counting on something special, a gift from my parents to mark the milestone, something to remind me that my efforts and good behavior mattered. But that day, instead of a present for me, the entire focus was on Cassidy. She got a brand new car, a flashy cherry red convertible that gleamed like a trophy. Everyone oohed and awed over her. I smiled through the celebration, but inside, a hollow ache spread. I didn't say anything then. How could I? It was a family tradition to put Cassidy on a pedestal, no matter what. Over the years, that dynamic didn't just stay the same, it grew more suffocating. I found myself picking up the tab for Cassidy's rent when she couldn't find work. I co-signed leases and loans, paid off her credit card balances, and covered for her when she missed deadlines. Mom and Dad never questioned it, as if my sacrifices were invisible by design. They praised Cassidy's potential, even as she drifted aimlessly, letting the debts pile up. I became an ATM disguised as a sister, expected to provide without complaint. And it wasn't just money. I was the emotional safety net, too. When Cassidy spiraled into one of her dramatic episodes, threatening to drop out of classes or move back home, I was the one who answered her calls at 2 a.m., offered advice, and rearranged my schedule to be there for her. My own frustrations and dreams took a back seat. I told myself it was family loyalty, a noble sacrifice for the sake of peace, but peace was never really there. It was just a fragile illusion that masked a growing resentment, quiet and simmering beneath the surface. What hurt the most was how my efforts were taken for granted, erased as if I was just part of the furniture. I would hear my parents gush over Cassidy's struggles at dinner parties, as if the years of my hard work didn't exist. They painted her as the victim, while I was the unreasonable one who didn't do enough. It was a role I never asked for, yet I played it perfectly, because I was desperate for their approval, for the family harmony that always seemed out of reach. Now, looking back, I see how deeply those patterns shaped me. I learned early on that being the responsible daughter meant suppressing my own needs, swallowing my voice, and shouldering burdens that weren't mine to bear. I was the one expected to fix everything, while Cassidy was allowed to stay broken, protected by favoritism and blind indulgence. And still, I kept hoping that one day all the sacrifices would mean something, that the scales would tip in my favor, even just a little. But with every passing year, that hope felt more like a mirage, fading further away. The demand for my penthouse wasn't just a request. It was the latest reminder that in my family's eyes, my boundaries didn't matter. My dreams and achievements were secondary to their entitlement. I realized then that this wasn't just about property. It was about a lifetime of unfairness, about being asked to surrender everything while barely being seen. It was the invisible debt I'd been repaying since I was a child, now coming due in the harshest way. And as the echoes of that dinner played over in my mind, I felt a quiet but fierce determination begin to take root. The past was a heavy chain, but maybe, just maybe, I could start breaking free. I've pushed myself to the limits, and then some, just to keep my family afloat. It wasn't a choice born of desire. It was necessity, a role I slipped into so seamlessly that I barely noticed how much I was giving up until I was halfway buried under the weight of it all. There was the time I co-signed Cassidy's student loan when she decided to go back to school for the third time. I remember sitting across from the bank officer, the sterile office smells filling the air while Cassidy sat beside me, scrolling through her phone with that same look of entitlement I'd grown used to. I tried to hide my hesitation, the knot tightening in my stomach as I signed away my financial security for her future, a future she seemed too distracted to care about. But I told myself it was family. It was what you do. Covering her bills became a routine. Phone bills, credit cards, rent, you name it. When Cassidy's landlord called me about overdue rent, I swallowed my frustration and assured him payment was on its way. I'd transfer the money from my account, watching my own savings dwindle in the background. I didn't tell Ethan every time I bailed her out. I knew he felt the strain too, but didn't want to add to his worries. Still, the exhaustion was real. I'd lie awake at night, the glow of my phone lighting up the dark room, tallying the debts, calculating how much more I could spare without sinking myself. Even my career took a back seat. When my parents started needing more help, I don't know if it was just aging or just another way to pull me in, I adjusted my goals. I postponed a promotion opportunity because it meant more travel and longer hours. I chose to be here, in town, to coordinate their appointments, manage their medications, and be the emergency contact for every minor crisis. It wasn't glamorous, but I did it with quiet resolve. Ethan watched me make those sacrifices, offering silent support, his hands often squeezing mine when the burden felt too heavy. One Christmas stands out in sharp relief. I had just received a substantial bonus at work, and instead of celebrating with something for myself, I gave it to Cassidy. She'd been complaining about debts piling up from a failed venture, and despite every instinct telling me to protect my hard-earned money, I handed it over. Her thanks were a shrug and a half-hearted, thanks, I guess. The sting of that casual dismissal cut deeper than I expected. I remember feeling invisible, like I was a charity case rather than a sister. Ethan noticed my mood shift but didn't push. He knew it was another moment where my heart was getting chipped away. Still, I clung to the hope that my generosity would eventually be recognized, that my sacrifices, financial and emotional, would earn me a place of respect within the family, that maybe Cassidy would finally step up, or my parents would see me not just as an ATM or a caretaker, but as an equal. But the latest demand at dinner, the casual expectation that I hand over my penthouse, felt like a slap in the face, a brutal reminder that none of it mattered. I realized then that the line between support and exploitation had blurred beyond recognition. My family's idea of unconditional love seemed to mean unconditional taking, with no regard for my own needs or boundaries. And the hardest part wasn't just the money or the time, it was the erasure of my identity, my autonomy, the dismissal of everything I'd worked so hard for. Ethan and I have talked about this quietly, the tension ever present beneath our conversations. He worries quietly that I'm stretched too thin, that the constant giving is eroding who I am, but I hesitate to admit it, even to myself. The fear that if I pull back, I might lose the fragile threads holding us all together. Yet, deep down, I know those threads are fraying fast. These sacrifices have come at a cost, one I'm only beginning to fully understand. The exhaustion, the resentment, the quiet anger, all simmer beneath the surface, waiting for a moment to explode. And as I sit here now, reflecting on all those years spent bending and breaking to keep everyone else afloat, I can feel that moment approaching, because generosity without boundaries isn't strength, it's surrender, and I'm not ready to surrender anymore. That evening, the dining room was buzzing with the usual mix of chatter and clinking glasses, the warm glow of candles casting flickering shadows against the polished wood. Relatives I barely saw outside these annual gatherings filled the seats, their smiles polite but tinged with curiosity as if waiting for the next family drama to unfold. I tried to focus on the roast in front of me, the smell of rosemary and garlic filling my senses, pretending the tension didn't press in like a physical weight. Mom was unusually animated that night, her laughter a little too sharp, her eyes flicking toward me and Cassidy with a kind of calculating sparkle. Cassidy, as always, seemed eager to draw attention, recounting her latest struggles with such dramatic flair that even the cousins exchanged knowing looks. I could see the exhaustion hidden beneath her words, the kind that comes not from real hardship, but from the constant need to be seen as the victim, the one who deserves help. And then, as the conversation lulled for a moment, Mom leaned forward, her voice smooth but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Cassidy really needs a place of her own," she said, slicing through the room's chatter like a knife. "Reese, maybe it's time you considered giving her the penthouse." The words hit me like a sudden gust of cold wind, chilling the warmth that had briefly settled over the table. The room seemed to pause, as if everyone was waiting for my reaction, eyes flicking between me and Mom with a mixture of expectation and judgment. I forced a smile, nodding politely, but inside, my heart thudded with a mix of shock and simmering anger. The penthouse, my sanctuary, The place I had built with years of sacrifice was being offered up like a family heirloom, something that belonged to Cassidy by default, simply because of her place in the family. Dad let out a low scoff, the sound rough and dismissive. Selfish, he muttered under his breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Reese has always been selfish. Cassidy's been struggling, and she deserves a break. His eyes narrowed, the scowl deepening lines across his forehead. She's the one who's really had it hard. What has Reese done but hoard what's hers? The cousins exchanged awkward glances, the earlier warmth evaporating into a cold silence. I felt a sting of humiliation creeping up my neck as if their looks were sharp enough to cut through me. I tried to brush it off with a joke, something light to deflect the weight of their accusations, but my voice sounded brittle, my words faltering. Well, maybe I'm just fiercely independent, I said, forcing a laugh that didn't reach my eyes. But no one joined in. The laughter around the table was strained, and I could feel the distance growing, a widening gulf between what I had fought for and the versions of me my family chose to see. My achievements, my hard work, they were dismissed as greed, as if my success somehow meant I had less right to protect what was mine. Mom's smile never wavered, but it was a practiced mask. Family first, Reese, she said softly, leaning in as if imparting a secret. You have to think about what's best for everyone, not just yourself. Cassidy needs support, and this way, we all stay together. The phrase family first echoed hollowly in my mind. It was the same line they'd used for years, a mantra meant to guilt me into compliance. But tonight, it felt like a weapon, a way to erase my boundaries and rewrite my sacrifices as selfishness. I swallowed hard, feeling a tight knot form in my stomach as the room's atmosphere thickened with unspoken expectations. I looked around at the faces, some sympathetic, many indifferent, a few openly critical. The warmth of the gathering had turned into a stage for judgment. The relatives, once friendly, now seemed complicit in the silent pressure to surrender what was rightfully mine. The conversation shifted again, laughter tentatively returning, but the damage was done. The echo of Mom's words lingered like a shadow, coloring every smile and toast. I sat there, the silver bracelet on my wrist suddenly feeling heavy, a reminder of the ties that bound me and the weight of their demands. Inside, a quiet storm brewed, resentment flickering beneath the surface, mingling with a deep, aching sadness. I realized in that moment how invisible I had become, how my family's eyes no longer saw the person I was, but only what I could give them. My identity was reduced to a resource, a well to draw from, and the penthouse was just the latest price they expected me to pay. As the night wore on, I found myself retreating inward, focusing on my breathing, counting to 10 to hold back the surge of emotions threatening to spill over. The penthouse was more than a home. It was my hard-won independence, my defense against the very neglect and entitlement that filled the room. And yet, here I was, expected to relinquish it without question. That dinner crystallized a painful truth. No matter how much I gave, it would never be enough. My family's definition of loyalty was one-sided, a demand for my sacrifice masked as love. The polite smiles, the forced pleasantries, they were all just a veneer, barely concealing the cold reality beneath. As I excused myself early, escaping to the quiet refuge of my penthouse, the words, "Maybe it's time you considered giving her the penthouse," echoed relentlessly in my mind. The battle was no longer just about a property. It was about my worth, my dignity, and the boundaries I had yet to draw. And I knew, with a clarity that both frightened and steeled me, that the fight was just beginning. When I finally found the courage to say the word that had been lodged in my throat for so long, I didn't soften it or disguise it with hesitation. I looked Dad straight in the eye and said, "No." The single word landed like a thunderclap in the room, sharp and unyielding. I was done bending, done shrinking myself to fit into their version of family. My voice was steady, despite the pounding of my heart in my chest. For a brief moment, the room froze. The jovial hum of conversation dropped into a suffocating silence. All eyes turned on me, as if I had cracked the fragile facade they'd all been maintaining. Dad's face changed before I could even fully register it. His brows knitted tight, his nostrils flared, and a vein throbbed visibly along his temple. Rage twisted his features until he was unrecognizable, a storm dangerously close to breaking loose. Then, without warning, his hand shot out with a force that knocked the breath from me. The slap was sharp and brutal. The sting burned red across my cheek. But what haunted me most was the shock. Shock that the man I'd once idolized could so easily break the line of respect, crossing into violence in front of everyone. My silver earring, the one that had been a gift from my late grandmother, caught the force of the blow. It slipped loose from my earlobe and tore through the air, landing on the polished wooden floor with a cold, metallic clink. The sound echoed unnaturally loud in the stunned silence that followed, like the shattering of something far more precious than jewelry. People sat frozen, mouths slightly open, disbelief etched on their faces. Mom's eyes flickered, but she said nothing, not a word. Cassidy, my sister, watched with a barely concealed smirk, as if this moment was the satisfaction of some secret victory. Ethan's reaction was immediate. He reached down swiftly, picking up the earring with trembling fingers, his eyes wide and filled with a mixture of anger, fear, and helplessness. I touched my cheek, the heat of the slap still radiating in waves. The physical pain was sharp, but the emotional wound was far more raw. Every sacrifice, every unpaid debt, every sleepless night came crashing down in that moment, crystallizing into a brutal clarity. They never saw me as their daughter, their sister, their family. I was a possession, a tool to be used, and when I refused, I was punished. The relatives, once so polite and distant, now looked away or shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The room seemed to shrink around me, the walls closing in as if to suffocate not just my body, but my very voice. Yet beneath the shock and humiliation, a cold, fierce resolve began to harden inside me. This was the line I would no longer allow them to cross. Mom's silence was the most painful sting of all. She had always been the diplomat, the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over cracks with gentle words and forced smiles. But now, she was complicit in their cruelty by her refusal to speak out, to defend me, or even to acknowledge what had just happened. Her quiet acceptance told me everything I needed to know about where her loyalties truly lay. Cassidy's smirk was a silent taunt, a reminder that in their eyes, she was the favored child, the golden girl who could do no wrong, and who was entitled to everything, even at the cost of my dignity. Ethan's steady presence at my side was a fragile anchor in the storm, but I could see the pain in his eyes. He wanted to fight, to protect me, but the dynamics were tangled and toxic. I sat there, stunned yet awake in a way I hadn't been before. The slap, the earring falling, the silence from everyone. These weren't just moments frozen in time. They were a brutal declaration of the reality I had been skirting around for years. My family's love was conditional, their respect conditional, their loyalty conditional, and I was no longer willing to accept less than I deserved. The room remained still, the clock ticking loudly in the background. I could feel the weight of every pair of eyes, the unspoken questions and judgments hanging thick in the air. No one moved to bridge the divide. No one dared to speak. It was as if the slap had cracked open a hidden truth, too uncomfortable to face. I wiped my cheek slowly, my fingers brushing against the faint, burning sting. The silver earring glittered in Ethan's palm, a small, shining reminder of everything I was fighting to protect. Not just a piece of jewelry, but a symbol of my identity and independence. And in that quiet, fractured moment, I made a silent vow. This would not break me. It would only be the catalyst for change. The evening's celebration had turned into a battlefield, and I was no longer willing to be the casualty. The penthouse, my autonomy, my dignity, they were mine, not bargaining chips for their entitlement. And even as the room held its breath, suspended in uneasy silence, I felt a fierce, unyielding strength take root deep inside me. This was no longer just about family expectations or polite refusals. It was a reckoning. The lines had been drawn, and I was ready to stand firm, even if it meant standing alone. Later that night, wrapped in the quiet solitude of my penthouse, I finally let the floodgates open. I sat on the edge of the couch, the city lights sprawling beneath me like a distant, indifferent constellation. The room was still, but my mind was anything but. Every moment from dinner replayed in a relentless loop. The sharpness of Dad's words, the cold weight of his hand on my cheek, the hollow silence from Mom, Cassidy's smug expression. It was like a slow-motion film I couldn't pause or escape. As I sat there, the physical sting of the slap faded into an ache that settled deep in my chest. But what really gnawed at me was the raw, gnawing pain of betrayal, the kind that cuts deeper than flesh, because it's about being discarded by the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. My family hadn't just crossed a line, they had erased it altogether. I thought back to the countless years I'd carried their burdens, years I hadn't fully acknowledged until now. I saw clearly how I'd been the one footing Cassidy's rent when she was unemployed, covering the credit card bills she ignored, co-signing loans she never seemed to repay. I remembered how many times I'd answered her desperate midnight calls, rearranged my schedule to babysit her crises, always putting her needs before my own. Each sacrifice, each unpaid debt, hadn't been met with gratitude. It had been met with entitlement. And where were Mom and Dad in all this? Always hovering on the sidelines, quick to praise Cassidy's potential, quick to dismiss my contributions as mere obligations. They praised Cassidy's struggles, painted her as a victim worthy of rescue, while I was the villain, the selfish daughter who didn't do enough. I saw the pattern, laid bare in painful clarity. I was the family ATM, the emotional punching bag, the problem fixer no one wanted to acknowledge. That thought stung worst of all. Not that I'd been used, because I'd known that, felt it, but that my sacrifices had been invisible, erased by their ignorance and entitlement. I had been bending and breaking, swallowing my own pain, all in the name of family loyalty that was really just a one-sided demand. The weight of it all finally hit me like a tidal wave. I realized I'd been drowning in their needs and demands without a lifeline. As the anger bubbled up, it chased away the grief that had first consumed me. For years, I'd carried a quiet sorrow, a sadness that maybe, just maybe, my family loved me in their own flawed way. But now, that hope shattered like glass. This wasn't love. It was control dressed up as duty, manipulation masquerading as care. Their demand for my penthouse was not about family, but about power and entitlement, a way to keep me tethered and expendable. I told myself firmly, with a voice that was no longer trembling, they will never change. I owe them nothing. It was a truth I'd buried beneath years of self-sacrifice and denial, but now it surfaced fully, raw and unambiguous. I owed them no more money, no more favors, no more silence. My boundaries were mine to set, and this line they demanded I cross, the surrender of my home, my independence, was one I would never cross. The clarity was both freeing and terrifying. For so long I had been trapped by invisible chains of guilt and obligation. But in this moment of reckoning, I saw those chains for what they were, shackles fashioned from entitlement and neglect. If I continued to bend, I would break completely. I realized that anger wasn't just a destructive force, it was the spark of survival, the flame that could light my way out of this suffocating darkness. I looked around my penthouse, the space I had carved out for myself against all odds. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every corner held the story of my hard work and resilience. It was more than just a home. It was my sanctuary, my defiance, my declaration that I deserved respect and autonomy. And I knew, deep down, that protecting it was now part of protecting myself. As the night deepened and the city's hum faded into silence, I sat upright, a new resolve settling like armor around my heart. I would no longer be their victim, or their ATM. This was the moment my life shifted, from silent endurance to deliberate, unyielding action. The fight for my dignity and freedom was just beginning, and as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I felt a fierce determination welling inside me, a promise that I would reclaim my life on my terms, no matter what storms lay ahead. That night, alone in the quiet sanctuary of my penthouse, I began to map out the terrain of this battle I was suddenly thrust into. The first step was understanding exactly how dependent they were on me, not just emotionally, but financially and legally. I sat at the polished glass dining table, a stack of documents spread before me, illuminated by the soft glow of my desk lamp. It was time to stop drifting in reaction and start steering my own course. I pulled up the family's shared financial accounts on my laptop, accounts I'd managed quietly for years, checking the balances, recent transactions, loan payments, credit card statements. I realized how deeply entangled my resources were in propping them up. My name was on everything, from the joint credit cards mostly used by Cassidy, to monthly transfers that padded Cassidy's rent and lifestyle, to payments on Dad's shaky business investments. The invisible web I'd woven was vast, and it was time to unravel it strategically. With a deep breath, I opened a file folder labeled Cassidy. Inside were receipts, bank statements, and copies of loan documents, evidence of her mounting debts, some of which I had co-signed without fully grasping the consequences. I scanned through a long overdue credit card bill. It was staggering. I'd been silently bailing her out for years, but now I saw the scale laid bare. It wasn't just financial support anymore. It was enabling her to live without accountability. My stomach tightened at the thought that my efforts had helped sustain this unhealthy dynamic. Next, I turned my attention to Dad's business interests. I had access to the family's investment portfolio, a collection of small holdings Dad managed, supposedly for our collective benefit. But recently, those funds had been funneled into Cassidy's ventures, or more accurately, her failed ventures. I had the statements right there, showing the flow of money, the missed payments, the red flags. My heart sank. These investments were not only a source of family income but a symbol of legacy, and now they were being drained by entitlement and poor decisions. I knew I couldn't confront them without solid proof and a plan, so I began to compile everything: financial records, correspondence, notes from our conversations, and even discreet recordings of some of the more manipulative family interactions. I had learned, painfully, that documentation was my shield. Every text message from Mom insisting I think of family first, every veiled threat from Dad about putting the family's interests ahead, all carefully archived. It was tedious work, but necessary if I was going to protect myself. While I worked through the night, Ethan sat beside me, a quiet pillar of support. He didn't push or ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. Instead, he helped me reach out to a trusted family lawyer, one who specialized in estate and property law. We scheduled a confidential consultation, where I learned about my legal rights regarding the penthouse. My name was the sole owner, and the deed was clear. No one could force me to relinquish it without due process. That knowledge was empowering, a lifeline in the storm. The lawyer also advised me on securing my financial assets, updating account passwords, removing joint access where possible, and preparing to sever any financial ties that threatened my independence. I felt a surge of control returning, a stark contrast to the helplessness I'd felt at the dinner table. Every change was a reclaiming of my autonomy. I also reviewed the family's estate documents, wills, trusts, power of attorney arrangements. Through subtle channels, I discovered that Dad had left much of the estate in limbo, keeping control centralized. It was a power play, no doubt designed to keep the family under his thumb, with Cassidy as the favored beneficiary. I made mental notes of which documents I might need to challenge or renegotiate in the future. For the first time, I was seeing the battlefield clearly, beyond just family dinners and pointed accusations. At home, I changed passwords on all shared accounts and set up alerts for any unusual activity. I updated contact information with banks and investment firms, ensuring I alone received statements and notifications. The security system in my penthouse was upgraded, with new cameras and alarms, not just for physical safety but as a symbol. I was fortifying my boundaries. Throughout this period, I maintained a calm exterior around my family. No one suspected the storm brewing beneath my composed smile. I attended gatherings but kept conversations neutral, carefully steering clear of topics that might reveal my preparations. Their entitlement was a beast best faced with calculated moves, not impulsive confrontations. I realized the hardest part was balancing the cold logic of strategy with the emotional turmoil underneath. Every document I gathered, every phone call I made, was a reminder of how much I had invested in a family that so readily dismissed me. But that pain was fuel, not a chain. I had finally decided that I would protect what was mine, my home, my dignity, my future. As the days passed, my resolve hardened. The quiet work of preparation was like laying the foundation for a new chapter, one where I was no longer the passive victim, but the architect of my own destiny. I was readying myself to shift the balance of power, to draw lines that couldn't be crossed, and to reclaim respect that had long been denied. And somewhere deep inside, I knew that this path was lonely and fraught with risk. But I also knew that the cost of silence and surrender was far greater. The penthouse was more than just a property. It was the symbol of every sacrifice and every victory I had earned. Losing it without a fight would mean losing myself. So I prepared, not just papers, passwords, and plans, but my heart and mind for the confrontation ahead. The time to act was coming, and this time I would not back down. I started pulling away, not with a dramatic announcement or confrontation, but with small, deliberate shifts in how I interacted with my family, a quiet withdrawal designed to protect myself without igniting an immediate explosion. At first, it was as simple as returning Cassidy's calls later than usual, letting the ring go unanswered more often than not. Where before I'd drop everything to answer her frantic pleas for help, now I let the voicemail take the brunt of it, forcing her to wait just a bit longer for my attention. I could almost hear the frustration crackle through her voice when she finally did catch me, realizing I wasn't on call 24/7 anymore. Declining to co-sign her bills or loans was harder, though. I'd spent years as her financial safety net, the invisible guarantor shielding her from the consequences she refused to face. But now, when she asked, this time with a sharper edge, a little less polite, I said no. I told her, honestly but firmly, that I couldn't keep enabling her lifestyle. I'm sure it hit her like a blow. Her usual smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of genuine shock. It was the first time she'd been truly confronted with limits. Equally difficult was pulling back from family events that had become toxic arenas. Invitations came with that familiar undercurrent of manipulation. Mom's sweet, coaxing voice saying, "We really want you there, Reese. It's important we all stay close." I knew better. Those gatherings were less about warmth and more about control, a stage for guilt trips and veiled demands. So, I started saying no, not always outright, but with plausible excuses, work commitments, a headache, needing to catch up on rest. Each refusal was a small rebellion, a reclamation of my time and emotional energy. Behind the scenes, I took strategic steps to safeguard my independence. I contacted the banks managing the family's shared accounts and insisted on removing joint access wherever possible. It was a delicate process. I had to navigate tangled paperwork and avoid raising alarms. But gradually, I secured my financial domain, ensuring that Cassidy and even my parents couldn't make withdrawals or transfers without my explicit consent. It was about drawing clear, enforceable boundaries. Then came the penthouse deed. I double-checked the documents, confirming that my ownership was unequivocal and legally binding. To reinforce my position, I had my lawyer draft notices clarifying that the property was under my sole control and that any unauthorized claims or attempts to access would be contested. It was no small step, like marking a line in the sand and daring them to cross it. Throughout this period, I maintained a composed exterior during family interactions. I didn't want to give away how carefully I was dismantling the financial safety net they'd come to rely on so heavily. If anything, I smiled more, kept conversations light, and avoided topics that could reveal my true intentions. But beneath that calm, I was meticulously documenting every interaction. The text messages where Cassidy demanded money, the passive-aggressive comments from Mom, even Dad's subtle threats veiled as family advice. Each note was a piece of armor, a layer of protection accumulating for the inevitable confrontation. Emotionally, it was exhausting. Part of me ached to maintain the facade, to keep peace even as I was quietly withdrawing. The memories of past sacrifices, the nights I stayed up paying bills, the times I rearranged my life to be there for them, clashed with the new reality I was forging. But I knew I couldn't keep giving without getting burned. No more invisible debts. No more one-sided loyalty. I also felt the strain on Ethan. He was my pillar, silently enduring the tension, always ready to catch me if I stumbled. Sometimes, late at night, he would ask if I was sure about pulling away, worried about the family fallout. I'd nod, assuring him I had to do this, not just for myself, but for us. It was hard for him too, watching me build walls that kept the people I once loved at a distance. As the weeks passed, the changes rippled through the family. There were murmurs of confusion. Why was Reese no longer the reliable fixer? Why had she suddenly become distant and unavailable? Cassidy's calls grew sharper, more demanding, but I stood firm, refusing to slip back into old patterns. My parents' disappointment was palpable, but they masked it with thinly veiled comments about family values and putting others first. I saw through it all. Still, none of them had any idea how thoroughly I was preparing. Behind the scenes, I was tightening security on my accounts, upgrading the Penthouse's alarm system, and keeping my lawyer on speed dial. I was building a fortress, not just of walls and wires, but of documented facts and legal protections. Each quiet withdrawal was part of a larger plan, a strategic retreat to a position of strength. The tension simmered, unseen but undeniable. The family dinners grew more strained, the conversations more guarded. My presence was still there, but the dynamic had shifted. I was no longer the open book, the easy mark. I was becoming untouchable. And yet, beneath it all, I knew the storm was still gathering. The calm before the inevitable confrontation was fragile, a delicate balance held by my silence and their assumptions. But I was ready. Every subtle withdrawal, every boundary set, every legal safeguard put in place was a step toward reclaiming my life, my home, and my dignity. The battle lines were drawn quietly, but the war was about to begin. The day of the next family gathering arrived with the usual blend of anticipation and unease. The sprawling dining room was filled with familiar faces, some curious, some wary, others openly skeptical. The weight of unspoken tensions hung in the air like a thick fog, but I carried a calmness beneath my skin that surprised even me. This time, I wasn't just bracing for another round of subtle jabs and passive-aggressive demands. I was armed, with truth, with documents, and with an ironclad resolve. As everyone settled around the polished oak table, the clinking of glasses and polite chatter began, but my mind was elsewhere. I had rehearsed my words, the facts I needed to present, and the boundaries I would no longer allow to be crossed. The moment had come to confront the entitlement that had been quietly siphoning away my peace for years. When the conversation lulled, I cleared my throat gently. All eyes turned toward me, a mix of curiosity and suspicion flickering in their expressions. I met Dad's cold gaze without flinching and began, my voice steady but resolute. "I want to make something very clear," I said. "The Penthouse is legally and solely mine. I've transferred the deed into my name exclusively. Cassidy no longer has any claim or access to it." The words landed deliberately, each syllable cutting through the haze of expectation like a sharp blade. A hush fell over the room as the relatives exchanged surprised glances. Cassidy's expression shifted from smug entitlement to pale shock, her mouth opening slightly, but no words came out. Dad's jaw clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. The patriarch who had once wielded control with ease now seemed momentarily unmoored. I reached into my folder and pulled out the official documents, copies of the deed, notarized and stamped, proof of the legal transfer. One by one, I laid them on the table between us, the crisp pages a physical manifestation of the boundary I was drawing. "But that's not all," I continued, feeling the surge of empowerment with every statement. "I've also removed Cassidy's access from all shared family financial accounts. The funds that once supported her lifestyle through our family business investments are now under my sole control. No more transfers, no more bailouts." The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. I could see Mom blink rapidly, a flicker of panic behind her carefully composed facade. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but I held up a hand, signaling that I wasn't finished. "This isn't about punishment or revenge," I said. "It's about fairness and respect. I have carried this family's burdens for far too long, financially, emotionally, and otherwise. It ends now. No more entitlement, no more abuse, no more taking what isn't freely given. Cassidy's face twisted, a storm of emotions flickering across it. Shock, anger, desperation. But she was silent, unable to counter the undeniable truth laid bare. Dad's posture stiffened, his authoritative mask slipping as the reality of my decision settled over the room. For a moment, the relatives sat frozen, caught between disbelief and the dawning recognition that the family dynamics were shifting irreversibly. The polite smiles faded, replaced by strained expressions and whispered murmurs. Ethan's hand found mine under the table. His steady presence was a quiet reassurance, a tether to the strength I was summoning. I squeezed his hand gently, drawing courage from his unwavering support. I watched as the old power structures crumbled in real time. The golden child's entitlement challenged, the patriarch's control questioned, and the enabler's manipulation exposed. This was more than a confrontation over property or money. It was a reckoning with years of imbalance and invisible pain. I spoke again, softer, but no less firm. From this point forward, I'm setting clear boundaries. My home, my finances, and my well-being are not negotiable. If that means stepping away from toxic patterns and relationships, then so be it. I will protect what I've earned, and myself. The room remained hushed, the tension palpable, as everyone absorbed the shift. I wasn't just defending a penthouse. I was reclaiming my life from the shadow of entitlement and abuse. The gathering ended not with the usual forced smiles or hollow reassurances, but with a charged silence that left no room for misunderstanding. I could feel the eyes on me, some measuring, some resentful, others perhaps grudgingly respectful. As we parted ways that evening, the atmosphere was irrevocably changed. The battle lines were now drawn in plain sight, and I was standing firmly on my side, strong, unyielding, and ready for whatever would come next. Chaos erupted almost immediately after I laid out the facts. The air, already thick with tension, snapped as if a live wire had been triggered. Cassidy's usual smirk vanished, replaced by wide-eyed panic. I could see it in the way her fingers trembled, the way she fumbled through her purse for her phone, desperately checking balances and notifications in a frenzy. The bills I'd stopped covering bounced back in rapid succession. Rent notices, credit card alerts, loan payment failures, each message a hammer blow to the fragile life she'd been living on borrowed time and borrowed money. Her voice cracked as she confronted my decision, the rehearsed entitlement faltering into raw desperation. "Reese, you can't do this! You're ruining me! Mom and Dad will make you see reason!" But the words felt hollow, even coming from her. Like a child shaking a fist at a storm they know they can't outrun. Dad, who had been rigid and stoic moments before, suddenly jumped into action with a calculated performance. His face softened, and he began to speak in that familiar, patronizing tone that had belied years of control and manipulation. "Reese, I know things got heated. Maybe we all got carried away. Family first, you know. We have to stick together, especially in times like these." But the warmth in his voice was fake, a mask crafted to disarm rather than comfort. His eyes flicked toward Mom, who was already wiping tears from her cheeks, her mascara smudging as she tried to hold the perfect image of the caring mother. Through her sobs, she managed to weave a guilt trip thick enough to fill the room. "Reese, sweetheart, don't you see? This is breaking up the family. Cassidy's struggling, and we're supposed to support each other. You don't want to be the one who tears us apart, do you?" The tears, the trembling voice, the soft pleas, they were all tools I'd seen before, used to keep me tethered and compliant. But this time, something inside me was different. The years of silent sacrifice, the bruises, both visible and invisible, had built a shield I wasn't ready to dismantle. Ethan stood quietly beside me, his steady gaze a quiet flame of support. He didn't interrupt, didn't argue. Instead, he just squeezed my hand, anchoring me to the reality that this was no longer just about family politeness or emotional blackmail. It was about survival and reclaiming my space. Around the table, the relatives murmured among themselves, whispers like distant thunder rolling in waves of judgment and uncertainty. Old alliances shifted visibly. Some faces betrayed sympathy, others cold disapproval. The carefully maintained facade of a happy family was cracking wide open, revealing the raw underbelly of entitlement and resentment. Cassidy's panic spiraled quickly into anger. You think you're so perfect, don't you? Always the responsible one. The golden girl. But look where that's gotten you. Alone, bitter, and miserable. She slammed her fist on the table, eyes blazing. Maybe it's time you faced reality. This family doesn't owe you anything. Her words stung, but I refused to let them pierce my armor. That bitterness was the bitter fruit of decades of indulgence and consequences avoided. She was lashing out because the safety net I'd been providing was gone. And suddenly, she was forced to confront what independence really meant. Dad's tone hardened again, the fleeting softness evaporating like smoke. You're being ungrateful, Reese. You forget everything we've done for you. You think you can just turn your back on family? There are consequences for that. His words carried a threat cloaked in paternal disappointment, a dangerous cocktail I was no longer willing to swallow. Mom's tears turned to quiet sobs, her voice breaking as she pleaded once more for peace. We're a family. We have to find a way through this together. Please, Reese, don't make this harder than it has to be. But I shook my head, my voice calm but firm. I'm done making it easy for people who see me as nothing more than a resource. This isn't just about money or property. It's about respect. I won't be manipulated or mistreated any longer. Every syllable carried the weight of years of hurt and the promise of a new boundary. For a long moment, the room was suspended in a tense silence, heavy with disbelief, anger, and reluctant acknowledgement. The old dynamics were unraveling in real time, and no one knew exactly what would come next. Ethan's presence at my side was steady and grounding. He whispered softly, "You did the right thing." His quiet support was a balm to the chaos swirling around me. As the gathering dispersed, the fallout was palpable. Cassidy's phone buzzed relentlessly with unpaid bills and angry creditors. Dad was already dialing frantic calls, planning urgent meetings filled with veiled apologies and veiled threats alike. Mom's guilt was a tangible cloud, heavy and suffocating, and through it all, I stood firm, knowing that this upheaval was just the beginning of reclaiming my life and setting the terms for whatever family would remain. The family, once a web of unchallenged entitlement, was now a fractured battlefield, and I was no longer silent in the crossfire. Weeks passed since that charged family gathering, and the ripple effects of my decisions were impossible to ignore. Cassidy's well-worn entitlement had collided head-on with the reality I'd imposed, and the consequences unfolded with a harsh clarity that left no room for denial. I started hearing through the grapevine, quietly at first, that Cassidy was facing eviction threats. The landlord, tired of falling rent payments, had finally taken steps to evict her. It felt surreal to hear it, almost like a scene from someone else's life. But no, this was real, unfolding because I had stopped bailing her out. The safety net was gone, and the fall was imminent. I wasn't sure if I felt relief, guilt, or something more complicated, a pang for a sister I'd tried to save, tangled up with the fierce resolve to no longer enable. The family business, too, began to show signs of strain. Dad's control over the investment accounts had been severed, and without access to those funds, the steady flow of money that propped up his ventures slowed to a trickle. I heard murmurs of missed payments and emergency meetings called in hushed tones. The patriarch who once commanded respect was now scrambling to patch together solutions without the financial leverage he'd always relied on. His usual confident posture was replaced by tight shoulders and a restless pace, betraying his growing anxiety. Social invitations to family events and gatherings started to dry up almost immediately. Word spread fast in our tight-knit circle. Whispers about the fracture in the Lane family. Speculation about what had happened at the last gathering. I knew the gossip would paint me as the villain, the cold-hearted sister who turned her back on her family. But the truth, my truth, felt heavier and more complicated than any rumor. I was no longer willing to sacrifice my peace to uphold a perfect family image. Even casual encounters with relatives became strained. Some crossed the street to avoid me, while others offered forced smiles that didn't reach their eyes. I could feel the silent judgment, the unspoken accusations hanging in the air. How could she do this to her own blood? But I held my head high, drawing strength from the fact that I had finally drawn boundaries that protected me. Cassidy's panic and desperation grew more palpable each day. I caught snippets of conversations through distant relatives and mutual friends, her frantic calls to creditors, her pleas to parents for rescue, the shame seeping into her voice as eviction notices piled up. It was a harsh awakening for someone who had long lived without consequences. I didn't relish her suffering, but I knew it was a necessary reckoning. Dad's health took a visible hit as well. The stress of losing control over family finances, compounded by the public unraveling of the family's facade, led to sleepless nights and a noticeable decline in his usual vigor. His once commanding presence was now overshadowed by frequent headaches and a weariness that settled deep into his bones. I saw the toll my actions had taken on him, but I also recognized it was a direct result of the toxic dynamics he perpetuated for decades. Attempts by Mom to mediate came with emotional appeals and guilt-laden conversations. She would call late at night, her voice trembling as she pleaded for reconciliation, for me to think of family and forgive. But the old patterns were broken. I listened, acknowledged her pain, but stood firm in my resolve. This was about survival, not just mine, but the family's, if it was to survive at all. Some extended relatives reached out with tentative apologies, hinting at regret over how the family had been torn apart. But those gestures felt too little, too late. After years of silent enabling and dismissal of my sacrifices, the damage was done, and the old dynamics wouldn't easily be restored. As the weeks turned into months, the social isolation around the Lane family deepened. Invitations to weddings, birthdays, and community events stopped coming. The once vibrant network that surrounded us thinned to a sparse echo. It was a consequence I'd anticipated, but still felt harsh. A reminder that standing up for oneself often comes at a cost. Cassidy's downward spiral was heartbreaking to witness from a distance. Where once she had floated through life supported by others, now she was forced to confront the harsh realities of independence. I heard that she'd stopped returning calls from friends, withdrawing into a shell of shame and anger. It was painful, but it also underscored the price of unchecked entitlement. Through it all, I remained steady, holding on to the peace that came from finally setting boundaries. It was a new kind of freedom, one that required sacrifice and endurance, but promised dignity in return. The burdens I'd carried for so long were now lifted, replaced by a sense of clarity and strength I hadn't known I possessed. I knew the road ahead would be difficult. Family ties, once tangled in obligation and guilt, were now frayed and uncertain. Some relationships might never heal, and that possibility weighed heavily at times. But I also understood that respect and honesty had to form the foundation of any hope for genuine connection going forward. For the first time in years, I felt a quiet peace, not because the chaos had disappeared, but because I was no longer carrying it alone. The Penthouse remained my sanctuary, a symbol not just of financial independence, but of personal victory. And in that space, I was finally able to breathe, to plan, and to rebuild life on my own terms. The fractures within the Lane family were deep, and the consequences of my stand were unfolding in real time. But beneath the weight of loss and estrangement, there was a spark of possibility, a chance to redefine what family meant, free from manipulation and entitlement. It was a hard path, but it was mine to walk. The weeks stretched into months, and the once familiar rhythm of the Lane family's interactions shifted into something unrecognizable. Some of them, those few who had the courage to face their own faults, began to accept the new reality. They reached out hesitantly, acknowledging the fractures and the consequences of years of entitlement and unchecked demands. But others retreated deeper into dysfunction, unwilling or unable to confront the truth I had laid bare. The family I once knew was unraveling, caught between denial and forced accountability. I found myself standing at a crossroads, both grieving what had been lost and fiercely protective of what I had gained. I realized that the old patterns, the invisible debts of loyalty and sacrifice, would never be restored on their terms. So I began to set clear, firm boundaries, not just in words, but in every interaction and decision that touched my life. It started simply but decisively. I made it clear that any future contact would require respect, honesty, and equality. If those conditions weren't met, I would not hesitate to walk away. I wasn't interested in empty apologies or veiled promises to change. I needed action, a genuine shift in how I was valued and treated. The penthouse, that symbol of my independence, was no longer just a home. It was a declaration. I would no longer be sacrificed or silenced for the sake of family appearances or entitlement. I remember the first time I had to enforce this boundary. A cousin reached out, cautiously asking if I would attend a family gathering. I told her truthfully that I would only come if the environment was respectful and free from the manipulations and demands that had poisoned every past gathering. I could sense hurt in her voice, but also relief, the acknowledgement that things couldn't stay the same. It felt like a small victory, a crack in the old fortress of dysfunction. Conversations with Mom and Dad became more guarded, less frequent. When Mom tried her usual guilt trips, pleading about how family should stick together or how Cassidy needed help, I calmly reminded her that unconditional love didn't mean unconditional taking. I told her that respect and fairness were the new foundation I demanded. Dad's responses were colder, sometimes laced with denial or thinly veiled anger, but I didn't engage with his attempts to manipulate or intimidate anymore. I had learned that silence and firmness were my strongest tools. Cassidy, predictably, oscillated between anger and desperation. The loss of financial support forced her to confront realities she'd long ignored. I didn't relish seeing her struggle, but I understood that her reckoning was necessary, for her growth and for the family's healing if that was even possible. I made it clear that I wasn't closing the door, but that any future relationship would have to be built on accountability and respect. For the first time, those words were not empty hopes. They were firm conditions. In the quiet moments, I reflected on what this all meant for me. The journey had been painful, lonely at times, with moments of self-doubt and sorrow. But through it, I discovered a strength I hadn't fully known before. I reclaimed not just a home, but a voice, a space where my worth wasn't measured by what I could give, but by who I was. I deepened my connection with Ethan and a small circle of close friends who had supported me unconditionally. They became my chosen family, the people who saw me, respected me, and celebrated my victories without strings attached. My penthouse, with its sweeping city views and quiet corners, was no longer a fortress built out of necessity, but a sanctuary filled with genuine love and peace. The lessons I learned were hard but clear. Family does not excuse abuse or entitlement. Love does not demand sacrifice at the cost of dignity. And boundaries are not walls to keep people out, but lines drawn to keep oneself safe. I committed to living these truths every day, even knowing it would mean navigating a complicated landscape where some bridges would remain burned. As the Lane family adapted to these new realities, I watched cautiously. Some embraced accountability, others withdrew into old patterns of dysfunction. The path forward was uncertain, but for the first time, it was mine to choose. I stood firm, no longer the silent bearer of burdens, but a woman who had fought for her worth and would guard it fiercely. The penthouse remained, bright, unyielding, a testament to every hard-won victory and every boundary set in love for myself. It was a new beginning, not just a place, but a declaration. Here, I am free.